Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Margaret Chen's photo restoration studio in downtown Portland, Oregon, creating a rhythmic backdrop to her meticulous work. She had been a professional photo conservator for 15 years, and her small studio on Morrison Street had become a sanctuary for people seeking to preserve their most precious memories. The space smelled of archival chemicals and old paper, with rows of carefully organized tools lining the walls and dozens of photographs in various stages of restoration spread across her workbenches. Margaret adjusted her magnifying lamp and examined the damaged photograph that had arrived that morning, delivered by a middle-aged woman who introduced herself simply as Claire Hannon. The photograph was severely damaged, with water stains, tears, and fading that suggested decades of neglect or perhaps deliberate concealment. It showed a family of 5 standing in front of a large Victorian house, the kind that dotted the historic neighborhoods of Northeast Portland. The image was dated from the early 1990s based on the clothing styles and the quality of the photographic paper. Margaret could make out a father figure, tall and imposing, standing at the center. Beside him stood a woman with blonde hair and a strained smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. 3 children completed the picture, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from what appeared to be 6 to 14 years old. The eldest son stood slightly apart from the group, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable beneath the layers of damage obscuring his face. Claire Hannon had been brief during the drop-off, her hands trembling as she placed the photograph on Margaret's desk. She explained that this was the only surviving image of her family from before everything fell apart, before the divorce, before the estrangement, before her brother David disappeared from all their lives. She wanted it restored for her mother's 70th birthday, hoping that perhaps the gesture might begin some kind of healing. Margaret had noticed the pain in Claire's eyes, the weight of unspoken trauma that so many of her clients carried when they brought damaged photographs to be repaired. She had learned over the years not to pry, to let the images tell their own stories as she carefully brought them back to life. Margaret began the painstaking process of digitally scanning the photograph at high resolution, her experienced eyes cataloging every tear, every stain, every faded section that would need attention. The Victorian house in the background was impressive, with ornate trim and a wraparound porch that spoke of better times and comfortable circumstances. She could see rose bushes in the front yard, slightly out of focus but suggesting careful maintenance and pride in the home's appearance. The father wore a business suit even in this casual family portrait, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of the middle child. The mother's dress was elegant but conservative, her other hand held protectively near the youngest child, the little girl with dark curls who couldn't have been more than 6 years old in the photo. As Margaret zoomed in on different sections of the image, she began the careful work of removing the water damage that had created brown stains across the bottom third of the photograph. The damage pattern was unusual, consistent with the photo having been submerged briefly or exposed to repeated moisture over time. She wondered about the story behind this neglect, about how the only surviving family photograph had been treated with such apparent disregard. Using specialized software, she began to reconstruct the missing pixels, drawing on her knowledge of period-appropriate colors and her intuitive understanding of photographic composition. The process was meditative, requiring intense concentration that blocked out the sound of the rain and the occasional sirens from the street below. The middle child, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, had a gap-toothed smile and messy brown hair that suggested he'd been playing before being called in for the photograph. His shirt was slightly untucked, and there was a grass stain visible on his knee that made Margaret smile. This child, at least, seemed to have had moments of normal boyhood joy. The youngest, the little girl, clutched a stuffed animal that was barely visible in the faded photograph, her expression serious and watchful in the way that some children have when they're constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the adults around them. Margaret had seen that look before, in her own childhood photographs, in the faces of kids who grew up in households where peace was fragile and temporary. As she worked through the afternoon, carefully reconstructing the color values and removing the scratches that crisscrossed the image like scars, Margaret found herself increasingly focused on the eldest son. David, Claire had called him, the one who had disappeared. His face was the most damaged part of the photograph, obscured by a series of tears and stains that seemed almost intentional in their placement. She began the painstaking work of reconstructing his features, using the undamaged portions of his face and making educated guesses about the missing sections. It was like completing a puzzle where crucial pieces had been deliberately removed. The autumn light fading outside her studio windows reminded Margaret that she'd been working for nearly 6 hours straight. She saved her progress and stepped back from the computer, rolling her shoulders to release the tension that had built up. The Hannon family photograph now looked significantly better than when it had arrived, though there was still substantial work to be done on the eldest son's face. She made herself a cup of tea and returned to the screen, determined to make more progress before calling it a day. There was something about this particular restoration that had captured her attention, a sense that she was uncovering something important hidden beneath the layers of damage and time. This evening settled over Portland and the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. Margaret increased the magnification on the eldest son's face and began the careful work of reconstructing the final damaged sections. She used specialized algorithms to predict the probable features based on the visible portions, cross-referencing with the other family members' facial structures to ensure genetic consistency. The father's strong jaw, the mother's high cheekbones, these elements would likely appear in some form in the eldest son. She worked pixel by pixel, carefully filling in the torn sections and removing the stains that had obscured his expression for so long that it was close to 8 in the evening when Margaret finally completed the reconstruction of David Hannon's face. She leaned back in her chair, studying the restored image with a mixture of professional satisfaction and growing unease. The eldest son's features were now clear and complete, showing a 14-year-old boy with dark hair and striking features that combined his parents' best qualities. But it was his expression that caught Margaret's attention and held it, sending a chill down her spine despite the warmth of her studio. Where the other children showed varying degrees of childhood innocence, where even the strained adults maintained appropriate family portrait expressions, David's face displayed something entirely different. His eyes held a darkness that seemed wrong for a child his age, a knowing quality that suggested experiences no teenager should have. But more disturbing was the subtle smugness in his expression, a barely concealed satisfaction that created a jarring contrast with the rest of the family portrait. Margaret zoomed in closer, studying the micro-expressions she'd carefully restored. The slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, the calculating look in his eyes, the way he held himself apart from the family unit while still technically being part of the frame. It was the expression of someone who knew something the others didn't, someone who held power they shouldn't have possessed. Margaret's professional instinct kicked in, and she began examining other details of the photograph more carefully. The father's hand on the middle child's shoulder now seemed more controlling than affectionate. The mother's protective gesture toward the youngest child took on a different meaning, as if she were shielding the little girl from something within the frame rather than outside it. The middle child's untucked shirt and grass stains suddenly looked less like normal boyhood messiness and more like signs of neglect or distraction from the parents. And the youngest child's watchful expression now seemed focused not on the camera but slightly to the side, toward where her eldest brother stood. But there was something else, something Margaret almost missed in her initial focus on faces and expressions. As she panned across the fully restored image, examining the background details she'd carefully brought back to life, she noticed something odd about the Victorian house's windows. In one of the upper floor windows, barely visible but now clear after restoration, there appeared to be another figure. Margaret increased the magnification dramatically, her heart rate accelerating as the details became clear. It was a face, pale and thin, pressed against the glass, partially obscured by curtains but unmistakably there. Another child, one who wasn't part of the family portrait outside, one who had been left inside the house. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. The image of that pale face in the window haunted her thoughts as she lay in her apartment in the Pearl District, listening to the rain that had continued unabated since morning. In 15 years of restoration work, she had never encountered anything quite like this. She'd restored thousands of photographs, uncovered hidden details, brought faded memories back to life, but she'd never revealed something that felt so fundamentally wrong, so potentially significant. The professional part of her brain insisted it might be a reflection, a trick of light and shadow, A coincidental arrangement of curtain folds and window glare that created the illusion of a face. But her instincts, honed by years of working with images and understanding the stories they told, knew better'd be why 6 in the morning, Margaret was back in her studio, brewing strong coffee and pulling up the Hannon photograph on her screen. In the gray light of dawn filtering through her windows, the image looked even more unsettling. She'd enhanced and clarified the window area overnight using automated processes, and now she examined the results with clinical precision. The face was definitely real, definitely a child, probably around the same age as the middle Hannon boy. The features were gaunt, suggesting malnutrition or illness. The expression was desperate, the eyes wide and pleading. This was not a casual observer watching the family photo session. This was someone who wanted to be seen, someone who needed help. Margaret faced an ethical dilemma that made her hands shake as she sipped her coffee. Her job was to restore photographs and return them to clients, not to investigate potential crimes or insert herself into family dramas. Claire Hannon had paid for a restoration, not an investigation. But Margaret also couldn't ignore what she'd uncovered. If this photograph captured evidence of something terrible, didn't she have an obligation to pursue it? She thought about Claire's trembling hands, her talk of estrangement and disappearance, her hope that the photograph might bring some kind of healing. What if healing required truth? What if the family had never known about the child in the window? As the morning progressed and Portland woke up outside her window, Margaret made the decision to do some research before contacting Claire. She started with the most obvious resource, the internet. She searched for news articles from the early 1990s involving the Hannon family in Portland. The search initially yielded nothing, which wasn't entirely surprising given how much pre-internet era news remained undigitized. She refined her search, adding terms like David Hannon and Portland scandal and 1990s. Still nothing definitive, though she found a few David Hannons in Portland, none with clear connections to the family in the photograph. Margaret then tried the county records database, using the Victorian house in the photograph as her starting point. The distinctive architecture and the visible street sign she'd restored in the corner of the image suggested the house was in the Irvington neighborhood, one of Portland's historic districts where such homes were common. She spent 2 hours cross-referencing property records with the name Hannon, finally finding a match. The house at 2847 Northeast Brazee Street had been owned by Robert and Susan Hannon from 1986 to 1994. The property had been sold in a foreclosure sale, suggesting financial problems or forced liquidation. This timeline aligned with what Claire had said about everything falling apart. Armed with names and an address, Margaret continued her search. She found Robert Hannon's obituary from 2003, listing him as survived by his wife Susan and 3 children, David, Claire, and Emma. The obituary was brief and formal, noting his career in commercial real estate and his involvement in various business ventures. There was no mention of any scandal or controversy, no hint of what might have torn the family apart. Susan Hannon proved harder to track, but Margaret eventually found her listed as a resident of an assisted living facility in Vancouver, Washington, just across the state line from Portland. This must be the mother Claire was planning the birthday celebration for, the one who was turning 70 at the middle child, the boy with the gap-toothed smile, took more time to locate. Margaret finally found a Marcus Hannon who matched the approximate age and location, working as a middle school teacher in Gresham, a suburb east of Portland. His public profile on the school website showed a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and the same smile from the photograph, though now marked by the years and experiences that had shaped him since that family portrait was taken. He seemed stable, normal, successfully integrated into ordinary life. This suggested that whatever had destroyed the family hadn't equally damaged all the children, or perhaps that Marcus had found ways to heal that his siblings hadn't. The youngest child, the little girl with the stuffed animal, appeared in Margaret's searches as Emma Hannon, now Emma Torres, living in Seattle and working as a social worker specializing in child protective services. This career choice felt significant to Margaret, suggesting that Emma's watchful childhood had transformed into a professional commitment to protecting children. Her LinkedIn profile showed someone accomplished and dedicated, with numerous certifications and commendations. Like Marcus, she seemed to have built a life beyond whatever trauma had marked the family. This left Claire and David, the one who'd brought the photo for restoration and the one who'd disappeared entirely. Margaret's search for David Hannon proved frustratingly fruitless. He had no social media presence, no professional listings, no property records, no digital footprint whatsoever after the mid-90s. It was as if he'd ceased to exist or had deliberately erased himself from all searchable records. This level of absence in the digital age required effort and intention. People who disappeared this completely were usually either dead, in prison, in witness protection, or actively hiding from something or someone. Given Claire's description of him disappearing from their lives, given the disturbing expression Margaret had restored in the photograph, she suspected the latter. The rain had stopped by early afternoon, replaced by the weak sunlight that characterized Portland's November weather. Margaret sat at her desk, surrounded by printouts of her research, facing the enhanced photograph on her screen. The face in the window seemed to stare directly at her, demanding acknowledgement, demanding investigation. She'd reached the limit of what she could learn through internet searches and public records. To go further, she'd need to contact the family, and that meant making a choice about how much to reveal and when. Margaret decided to start with the most neutral approach. She called the number Claire had provided, reaching voicemail. She left a message explaining that the restoration was progressing well, but that she'd discovered some details in the photograph that Claire might want to discuss before the final version was completed. She kept her tone professional and didn't mention the face in the window, simply requesting a callback at Claire's convenience. Then she waited, trying to focus on other projects but finding her attention constantly drawn back to the Hannon photograph and its hidden child. Claire called back within an hour, her voice tight with tension that suggested she'd been waiting for bad news. Margaret explained carefully that during the restoration process, particularly while working on the background details, she'd noticed what appeared to be another person visible in one of the house's upper windows. She described the figure neutrally, as a child of approximately 10 or 11 years old, visible in a second-floor window during the family photograph. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so prolonged that Margaret wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, saying she needed to see it in person and asking if she could come to the studio immediately. 30 minutes later, Claire Hannon sat in Margaret's studio, staring at the enhanced section of the photograph showing the window and its occupant. Her face had gone completely white, and her hands gripped the arms of the chair as if she might collapse without that anchor. Margaret watched with professional concern and human compassion as Claire struggled to process what she was seeing. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice hollow and distant, explaining that she had no memory of anyone else being in the house that day. The photograph had been taken by a professional photographer her father had hired, one of his attempts to project an image of family success and normalcy. She remembered standing in the yard, uncomfortable in her new dress, trying to smile for the camera while feeling the tension that always existed in their home. Claire continued, her words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. She talked about how David had been different from the other children, how he'd seemed to exist in his own world with his own rules. Her father had indulged him, given him freedoms and privileges that Marcus and Emma never received. There had been a darkness in their home, she said, things that weren't discussed, rooms that were kept locked, times when David and their father would have intense private conversations that excluded the rest of the family. Her mother had become increasingly withdrawn, spending more time in her bedroom, developing migraines that kept her isolated. Marcus had thrown himself into school and sports, rarely home except to sleep. And Emma, young as she was, had learned to be invisible, to stay quiet and unnoticed. Margaret listened as Claire described the event that finally shattered the family's facade. In the spring of 1994, about 2 years after the photograph was taken, her father had been arrested at his office. Claire had been 16, old enough to understand the charges even though the adults tried to shield her from the details. Robert Hannon had been running an illegal operation from his commercial real estate business, but it wasn't financial fraud or typical white-collar crime. He'd been involved in a network that exploited children, providing properties for abuse, facilitating connections between predators, using his legitimate business as cover for unthinkable acts. The investigation had been extensive, involving multiple agencies and multiple states. The family had disintegrated in the aftermath. David, who was 16 at the time, had been questioned extensively by investigators. He'd never been charged with anything, but according to Claire, the investigators had looked at him with suspicion, with disgust, with the kind of attention that suggested they believed he knew far more than he admitted. After their father's conviction and the loss of their home to legal fees and victim restitution, the family had scattered. Their mother had a breakdown and spent time in psychiatric care. Marcus had gone to live with an aunt in Eugene. Emma had been placed temporarily in foster care before being reunited with their mother once she stabilized. Claire had finished high school while living with a friend's family, trying to distance herself from the Hannon name and everything it now represented. And David had disappeared. Claire explained that he'd left Portland shortly after their father's trial concluded with a 25-year sentence. He'd been 17, legally still a minor, but the authorities had let him go. There had been rumors that he'd cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity, that he'd provided information about his father's network that helped secure additional convictions. But there had also been darker whispers, suggestions that David himself had been damaged beyond repair by his father's influence, that he'd learned things and done things that made him a risk. Claire hadn't heard from him in over 30 years. None of them had. He'd changed his name, cut all ties, vanished completely from their lives. She'd spent years in therapy trying to understand what had happened in her childhood home, trying to process the reality that her father had been a monster and that her family had unknowingly lived alongside unthinkable evil. Margaret felt sick as she listened, understanding now why the photograph had been so damaged, why it had been hidden away. But this made the face in the window even more significant, even more urgent. She asked Claire gently if she had any knowledge of her father keeping a child in their house, of there being someone locked in an upstairs room. Claire's face crumpled as she shook her head. She said the house had been large, with rooms they weren't allowed to enter, with a third floor that was supposedly storage but was always kept locked. David had sometimes been allowed up there with their father, a privilege that had seemed meaningless at the time but now carried horrifying implications. Could there have been someone kept in that house, hidden in plain sight? Could David have known? Could he have been involved? Margaret and Claire sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of implications pressing down on them like a physical force. The rain had started again, creating patterns on the studio windows that seemed to echo the chaos of their thoughts. Margaret's training told her that this situation now extended far beyond photo restoration into territory that required official involvement. If the photograph provided evidence of a crime, particularly one involving a child who might have been held captive, there were legal and moral obligations that superseded client confidentiality. Claire seemed to recognize this too, her face showing a mixture of dread and resignation as she looked from the photograph to Margaret and back again. Claire made the first decision, pulling out her phone with trembling hands and saying she needed to call Marcus. Her brother answered on the second ring, and Margaret could hear the warmth in his greeting turn to concern as Claire explained why she was calling. She asked him to come to the studio if possible, saying she'd discovered something about their past that he needed to see. Marcus, showing the kind of immediate responsiveness that suggested he'd been waiting his whole adult life for something more to emerge about their childhood, said he could be there within the hour. He taught afternoon classes that his colleagues could cover, and this felt more important than maintaining normal routines. While they waited for Marcus, Margaret made them both tea and tried to approach the situation with the professional distance her years of work had taught her. She asked Claire if she wanted to contact Emma as well, but Claire shook her head. Emma had worked hardest to move past their family's history, she explained. She'd changed her name through marriage, built a new life in a different city, established herself in a career that let her help children while maintaining boundaries around her own trauma. Pulling her back into this without clear purpose felt cruel. Better to wait until they knew more, until they understood what the photograph actually revealed and what, if anything, could or should be done about it. Marcus Hannon arrived looking exactly like his school photo but with the added markers of a life spent caring about others. His clothes were slightly rumpled, his hair needed cutting, and his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses showed the kind of gentle exhaustion that good teachers carry. He hugged Claire tightly, and Margaret saw decades of shared pain in that embrace, the unspoken understanding between siblings who'd survived something terrible together. When Claire led him to the computer screen and showed him the photograph, his reaction was immediate and visceral. He stepped back as if physically struck, his face losing color, his hand coming up to cover his mouth. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time, his eyes moving between the restored family portrait and the enhanced window section. He confirmed what Claire had said about rooms being off-limits, about David having special access to parts of the house. But he added details that Claire, being younger, either hadn't noticed or didn't remember. He described hearing sounds sometimes from the upper floors, footsteps and voices when supposedly no one was up there. He remembered David bringing food upstairs, plates of dinner that their father said were for David to eat while doing homework but which seemed like too much for one teenager. He recalled his mother becoming agitated when anyone approached certain doors, her insistence that they respect their father's need for private space for his work. Most chillingly, Marcus remembered the months leading up to their father's arrest. He'd been 12, old enough to sense that something was changing in their home. David had become more withdrawn, spending even more time in the locked areas of the house. Their father had been tense, making and receiving phone calls at odd hours, taking sudden trips that he didn't explain. And then one night, Marcus had woken to the sound of a car in their driveway at 2 in the morning. He'd looked out his window and seen his father and David loading something into the trunk, something wrapped in blankets that they handled carefully and quietly. The next day, his father had announced they'd be getting new carpeting in the upstairs rooms, and workmen had come to tear out and replace flooring that Marcus didn't think had needed replacement. Margaret felt the horror of what Marcus was describing settle over the room like a physical presence. Claire had gone completely still, processing implications she'd never considered. Margaret asked gently if Marcus had ever told anyone about the nighttime incident, about the wrapped object in the trunk. He shook his head, his voice rough with emotion as he explained that by the time he understood the magnitude of what his father had done, it had seemed too late, too uncertain, too potentially devastating to bring up what might have been innocent or meaningless. The investigators had been thorough, he said. Surely they would have found evidence of anything that had happened in the house. Surely the forensic examination would have revealed if someone had been kept there, if someone had been harmed there. But Margaret and Claire both knew that investigations, however thorough, could miss things. Evidence could be cleaned, explained away, lost in the overwhelming volume of other materials discovered. The focus of the investigation into Robert Hannon had been on his network, on the properties he'd provided to other predators, on the financial transactions that proved his involvement in organized exploitation. The family home had been searched, but perhaps not with the intensity that would be applied if investigators had known to look for evidence of someone being held there specifically. And if that someone had been removed before the investigation began, if the carpeting replacement had been part of a cleanup, physical evidence might have been erased. Claire asked the question that was hanging in the air. Who was the child in the window? Marcus added his own question. Was there ever a missing child case from that time period that might connect to their father, to their house, to the timeline of the photograph? Margaret, who'd been thinking along the same lines, suggested they needed to contact authorities. This wasn't something they could or should investigate alone. If the photograph provided evidence of an additional crime, if there was even a possibility that someone had been held in the Hannon house, professional investigators needed to be involved. Cold cases existed for situations exactly like this, where new evidence emerged years or decades after the original crimes. Marcus pulled up the website for the Portland Police Bureau on his phone, locating the cold case unit's contact information. But before making the call, he paused and looked at his sister. They needed to discuss what this might mean, he said. Their mother was elderly and fragile, living with the guilt and shame of having been married to a monster without knowing the full extent of his evil. Emma had built a stable life and career despite their traumatic childhood. Opening this investigation would bring media attention, renewed scrutiny, painful memories dragged back into the light. Was it worth the cost? Did they have a moral obligation to pursue this even if it hurt their family further? Claire's response came without hesitation. If there was any chance that the child in the window had been real, had been hurt, had been forgotten by the justice system, then they had to pursue it. Every child mattered, every victim deserved acknowledgement, and the comfort of the Hannon family was less important than the truth. Margaret watched Claire straighten her spine and make this decision, seeing the transformation from someone defined by her traumatic past into someone choosing to face it head-on for the sake of others. Marcus nodded slowly, agreeing, and pulled out his phone to make the call that would change everything again. The detective who arrived 2 hours later introduced herself as Sarah Martinez from the cold case unit. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of careful competence that came from years of handling cases where every detail mattered and mistakes couldn't be undone. She examined the photograph intently, asked detailed questions about the restoration process, and took extensive notes as Margaret explained how she'd uncovered the figure in the window. Detective Martinez confirmed that she was familiar with the Robert Hannon case, having been a junior investigator on periphery of the original task force. She remembered the house, the family, the devastating scope of Hannon's crimes. When Detective Martinez saw the enhanced image of the child in the window, her professional composure slipped briefly. She asked permission to take copies of the photograph and all associated restoration files, promising to maintain the chain of custody and ensure Margaret wouldn't be liable for any release of client materials given the circumstances. She then asked Claire and Marcus to come to the station to give formal statements about their memories of the house, the locked rooms, the incident with the trunk. This was officially a cold case investigation now, she explained. The photograph provided potential evidence of criminal activity that had not been previously investigated. She would need to assemble a team, review the original case files, and determine if enough evidence existed to warrant a full reinvestigation. Before leaving, Detective Martinez asked about David. She wanted his current contact information, his location, any details about his life after leaving Portland. Claire and Marcus explained that they had none of this information, that David had severed all contact and disappeared completely. The detective made notes but didn't seem surprised. She mentioned that this was common in families where one member had been groomed by an abuser, where the psychological damage was so severe that maintaining any connection to the family became impossible. She would attempt to locate David through official channels, though she warned that if he'd legally changed his name and deliberately obscured his trail, finding him might take time. After Detective Martinez left with her copies of the photograph and promises to keep them informed, Claire, Marcus, and Margaret sat in the studio as evening darkened the windows. They were bound together now by shared knowledge and shared responsibility for whatever came next. Claire asked Margaret to complete the restoration of the photograph but to prepare two versions, one that showed the face in the window and one that edited it out. The version without the face would be what she gave their mother for her birthday, allowing the elderly woman to have a memory of her family before everything shattered without the additional trauma of what the photograph had revealed. The version with the face would remain as evidence, as truth, as testament to what might have been hidden in their home. Marcus suggested they reach out to Emma before she learned about the investigation through other channels. Claire agreed, saying she would make the call that evening, giving their sister the choice of how involved to be in whatever unfolded. Margaret offered to provide any additional technical support the investigation might need, to explain her restoration process to forensic specialists, to testify if necessary about the authenticity of what she'd uncovered. They exchanged contact information and made plans to stay in touch as the investigation progressed, each of them understanding that they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The investigation that followed moved with both the urgency of potential justice and the careful deliberation required by decades-old evidence. Detective Martinez assembled a team that included forensic specialists, database analysts, and investigators who'd worked on the original Hannon case. They began by reviewing every document from Robert Hannon's arrest and conviction, looking for mentions of missing children, unexplained evidence, witness statements that might have pointed towards someone being held in the family home. The team cross-referenced missing persons reports from the Portland area spanning from 1986 to 1994, focusing on boys between the ages of 8 and 13 who'd disappeared without resolution. Margaret received regular updates from Detective Martinez, who appreciated having a civilian expert available to explain technical aspects of the photo restoration. The detective explained that the forensic team had confirmed Margaret's work was sound, that the figure in the window was definitely real and not an artifact of the restoration process. They'd also analyzed the photograph's metadata and confirmed its date as July 12, 1992, giving them a specific time frame to examine. Property records showed the Hannon family had owned the house for 6 years at that point, and Robert Hannon's criminal network had been active for at least a decade before his arrest. This meant there was a substantial window during which someone could have been held in that house. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into the reinvestigation when a database analyst found a missing persons report that had been filed in Vancouver, Washington in June of 1992. 10-year-old Christopher Reeves had disappeared from a park near his home, last seen talking to an adult male in a business suit who'd offered him money to help carry some boxes. The description of the man was vague, as was common in such cases, but it matched Robert Hannon's general appearance and his tendency to project professional respectability. Christopher had never been found, and the case had gone cold within a year, joining the heartbreaking list of missing children whose fates remained unknown. Detective Martinez showed Margaret, Claire, and Marcus a photograph of Christopher Reeves taken shortly before his disappearance. The resemblance to the face in the window was undeniable. The same thin features, the same wide eyes, the same dark hair. The possibility that had been abstract became concrete and devastating. Christopher might have been held in the Hannon house for at least a month, possibly longer, held prisoner in a locked room while the family lived their lives below, while David brought him food, while Robert Hannon used him for purposes too horrific to fully articulate. The thought made all of them physically ill, but it also provided a name, an identity, a family who deserved answers. The investigation team obtained a warrant to excavate the property at 2847 Northeast Brzee Street, which was now owned by a young couple who were shocked and horrified to learn about its history. Ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies in the backyard soil that warranted investigation, and cadaver dogs had alerted to areas near where the foundation met the earth. The excavation began on a cold morning in early December, with media trucks gathering outside despite the police department's attempts to keep the operation quiet. Claire and Marcus stood at a distance, watching as investigators carefully removed soil and examined what lay beneath decades of grass and weather and attempts to forget. They found him 3 days into the excavation, buried 4 feet deep in a section of the yard that had once been a flower bed. Christopher Reeves, missing for 33 years, reduced to bones and fragments of the clothing he'd worn the day he disappeared. The medical examiner's preliminary examination suggested he'd been dead for several weeks when buried, with evidence of malnutrition and healed fractures that told a story of prolonged captivity and abuse. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull, suggesting a violent end to his captivity. The excavation also revealed fragments of carpeting that matched the description of what had been replaced in the upstairs rooms, connecting the burial to the incident Marcus had witnessed from his window that night in 1994. The discovery transformed the case from speculation to murder, from possible evidence to undeniable fact. Robert Hannon, serving his sentence in Oregon State Penitentiary, was charged with the murder of Christopher Reeves and the additional charges related to false imprisonment and abuse of a minor. His legal team filed motions arguing that the charges came too late, that their client's health was poor, that prosecuting an elderly man for decades-old crimes served no purpose. But Christopher's family, notified after 33 years of uncertainty, demanded justice. They wanted their son's story told, his suffering acknowledged, his killer held accountable for every crime. The investigation team worked to determine David Hannon's involvement in Christopher's captivity and death. They located him through a combination of database searches and old-fashioned detective work, finding him living under the name Daniel Harris in a small town in Montana. He'd been working as a janitor, living alone in a trailer, existing on the edges of society with no meaningful connections or relationships. When detectives arrived to question him, he initially denied everything, maintaining he'd known nothing about Christopher Reeves or what his father had done in the locked rooms of their house. But confronted with the photograph showing Christopher in the window, with Marcus's testimony about the food being brought upstairs, with the timeline of the burial matching the carpet replacement, his denials crumbled. David Hannon, or Daniel Harris as he'd become, broke down in the interview room and confessed to being present when Christopher died. He explained through tears that his father had trained him from a young age, grooming him to be an accomplice, threatening him with violence if he revealed what happened in their home. He'd been 12 when his father first made him help with the crimes, 14 when Christopher was brought to their house. He'd been the one to bring food and water to the locked room, the one who'd seen Christopher's deteriorating condition, the one who'd been present when his father's violence had finally killed the boy. He'd helped wrap the body, helped bury it in the yard, helped clean the evidence afterward. He'd lived with the guilt and horror for over 30 years, never escaping the memories no matter how far he ran or how thoroughly he tried to erase his identity. The district attorney's office faced a complex decision about charging David. He'd been a minor during most of the crimes, clearly groomed and controlled by his father, potentially a victim himself even as he participated in victimizing Christopher. But he'd also been aware of what was happening, had taken actions that facilitated the abuse, and had concealed evidence of murder for decades. After extensive consultation with psychologists specializing in child abuse and coercion, the decision was made to offer David immunity from prosecution in exchange for his complete testimony against his father. The goal was to ensure Robert Hannon faced the maximum possible consequences for his crimes, and David's testimony would be crucial in achieving that. The trial took place in the spring of 2026, nearly 34 years after Christopher Reeves had been buried in the Hannon family's backyard. The courtroom was packed with media, with Christopher's family members, with advocates for missing children, and with members of the Hannon family trying to understand what their lives had been built upon. Claire, Marcus, and Emma attended every day of the trial, sitting together in silent support and shared grief. Their mother, Susan Hannon, was too frail to attend but provided a written statement expressing her horror at her late husband's crimes and her eternal sorrow for Christopher and his family. David's testimony was devastating. He described in detail how his father had operated, how the locked rooms had been used, how Christopher had been kept for approximately 2 months before dying from injuries sustained during one of Robert Hannon's violent outbursts. He explained how his father had threatened to kill his siblings if David ever revealed what happened, how he'd been convinced that protecting his family required his silence and complicity. He spoke of the decades of therapy he'd undergone, the suicide attempts, the complete inability to form normal human relationships because of what he'd witnessed and participated in. The jury, several members crying openly, convicted Robert Hannon on all charges. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Christopher's family to address Robert Hannon directly. His mother, now in her 60s, spoke of 33 years of not knowing, of hoping her son might somehow still be alive, of the torture of uncertainty finally replaced by the torture of knowing what he'd endured. His younger sister, who'd been 7 when Christopher disappeared, described growing up in the shadow of his absence, of their family never recovering from the loss, of their father dying without knowing what had happened to his son. They asked the judge to impose the maximum possible sentence, to ensure Robert Hannon spent whatever remained of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. Judge Robert Chin imposed consecutive life sentences for murder, false imprisonment, and abuse, ensuring that Robert Hannon would die in prison. In his remarks, the judge noted that the case represented the worst of what humans were capable of but also highlighted the importance of never giving up on justice for victims. He praised Detective Martinez and her team, acknowledged Margaret Chen's role in uncovering the evidence that had made the prosecution possible, and expressed his hope that the conviction would bring some measure of peace to Christopher's family. Robert Hannon showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced, his face blank and closed, offering nothing that resembled remorse or acknowledgement of his crimes. In the months following the trial, the Hannon family worked toward their own form of healing. Claire had the restored photograph framed, the version without Christopher in the window, and gave it to her mother on her 71st birthday, a year later than originally planned. Susan cried when she saw it, touching the faces of her children when they'd been young, before everything had fallen apart. She asked about David, and Claire gently explained that he was in treatment, trying to process decades of trauma, and that perhaps someday there might be possibility of limited contact, though no one knew if he'd ever be capable of having a relationship with the family again. Marcus found purpose in the case's conclusion, developing a curriculum for his students about the importance of speaking up when they witnessed or suspected abuse. He became an advocate for children's safety, working with local organizations to improve systems for identifying and responding to at-risk children. Emma, initially reluctant to engage with the reinvestigation, found that the trial and its aftermath had provided unexpected closure. She'd spent her career helping other families escape situations like the one she'd grown up in, and knowing that Christopher's family finally had answers made her own work feel more meaningful. Margaret continued her restoration work, but the Hannon case had changed her perspective on what her work could reveal. She began volunteering with cold case units, offering to examine old photographs for details that might have been overlooked, understanding that images captured more than the subjects in the frame, that hidden truths waited to be uncovered by patient attention and enhanced technology. The face in the window had changed multiple lives, had brought justice to a murdered child, had demonstrated that the past, however buried, could still speak if someone took the time to listen. David Hannon, living under a new identity arranged through the Witness Protection Program, remained in intensive therapy. His testimony had been the key to convicting his father, but it had also required him to relive every moment of Christopher's captivity and death, to acknowledge his own role, to face the reality that his silence for decades had allowed his father to die without fully accounting for all his crimes. He would never be prosecuted, but he would never be free from the weight of what he'd witnessed and failed to prevent. Some forms of imprisonment, he was learning, existed beyond prison walls. Christopher Reeves was finally laid to rest in a cemetery in Vancouver, 34 years after he'd been taken from the park near his home. The funeral was attended by dozens of people who'd never known him but had been moved by his story, by the injustice of his short life and brutal death, by the reminder that every missing child represented a family destroyed and a potential that would never be realized. His gravestone bore his name, his dates, and a simple inscription, "Found at last. Never forgotten." Margaret attended the service, standing at the back, honoring the boy whose face in a window had spoken across decades to demand justice. The Victorian house on Northeast Brzee Street was demolished 6 months after the trial concluded, the owners unable to continue living in a place with such dark history and unwilling to sell it to anyone else who might turn it into a macabre tourist attraction. The lot remained empty, eventually purchased by the city and converted into a small park dedicated to missing children. A memorial plaque listed Christopher's name and the names of other Oregon children who remained missing, a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance, for justice, and for never giving up on those who disappear. Years later, when asked about the case, Detective Martinez would describe it as a reminder that technology and technique could reveal truths hidden in plain sight, but that justice still required human courage to pursue those truths wherever they led. Margaret would speak of the responsibility that came with her work, the understanding that every photograph told multiple stories and that some of those stories needed to be heard even when they were painful. And Claire would reflect that the photograph she'd brought in for restoration had indeed brought healing, not through nostalgia or preserved innocence, but through truth, accountability, and the conviction that acknowledging past horrors was the only path toward genuine peace. The restored photograph hung in Claire's home, a reminder of the family they'd been before everything shattered. But nearby hung a photograph of Christopher Reeves, his school picture from 1992, a reminder of the boy who'd been forgotten but was now remembered, whose voice had finally been heard through the testimony of those who'd uncovered the truth hidden in a window, in a yard, in decades of silence. The juxtaposition of the two images told the complete story, a family destroyed by evil that lived among them, and a child whose disappearance had finally been explained, whose existence had finally been acknowledged, whose killer had finally faced justice for the darkest of his many crimes. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.